as another means to thank you, I want to bring attention to this room. This is kind of a bait and switch in that Sandy gave a testimony in front of Congress, and here you can find the link to it, which has perhaps one of the best maps I've seen of Syria's WMD arsenal and its facilities. It's interactive. So I would suggest you go to this because I'm not talking too much about the technicalities of Syria's WMD program, but what Iraq as a case study can offer, what can it tell us, what can we glean from the Iraqi case and apply to Syria. So this talk has 4 segments. The first part I want to deal with is an element that's kind of neglected in the WMD literature. It's this notion of WMDs and internal regime security. Okay, perhaps, like I said, the literature is limited on this subject. Gregory Koblenz and George Mason University have published a lot in this aspect. But how can WMDs be used in an internal domestic security role? And when I put the word sectarian in this, because a lot of the debate in the mainstream media and the Beltway is Syria's WMD arsenal not only an asset in terms of creating a deterrence against Israel's nuclear weapons capability, but what's coming up more and more in the literature is Syria's WMD program a means to buttress a minority Alawite rule in Syria? And this is the aspect I'll look at. There are numerous documents that have been released dealing with Iraq's WMD program. I'm going to try to glean at least 2 aspects from those documents. Not procurement, and not what the Iraq documents can tell us about deterrence, but rather what is important to understand is chain of command. Who commanded the deployment of chemical weapons in Iraq. And the reason why this is important, in the Syrian case, this is quite opaque. We don't know about the chain of command. Now, what I'll argue in this presentation is that it's unlikely, whereas compared to the Iraq case, that Syria would use WMDs in a counterinsurgency role. In Iraq it was done. I would argue it's unlikely in the Syrian case. But then, having said that, then what's the importance of studying chain of command? Well, what if the chain of command does break down in Syria? Perhaps looking at the Iraqi chain of command can offer us insights about how that chain of command can break down over the WMD arsenal in Syria. And second, if the government in Damascus were to fall, chain of command in the Iraq case can help us look for who would be controlling this arsenal in Syria at the present. So far, the literature on Syria's WMD arsenal is almost non-existent about who controls, deploys, orders weapons of mass destruction in Syria. There's plenty of literature. Well, I shouldn't say there's plenty of literature. The existing literature tells us what Syria could have, and I'm emphasizing could. The literature emphasizes how Syria could deploy. But in terms of who gives the orders, this still remains an issue that's quite opaque in regards to Syria, and this is the value of the Iraqi document. So what I'm going to try to argue is that security structures in Syria and Iraq are almost mirror images of each other. And if I can argue that, then that perhaps the Iraqi case can help us understand how Syria could be deploying, or how Syria could control its WMD arsenal. The third part of this looks at how weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical agents, were deployed in Iraq in a counterinsurgency role, as well as looking at examples of how it was deployed against the Iranian military. How is the process of WMD deployment? How do these weapons get deployed? And what were the tactical uses? What benefits did the Iraqis see, if any, from deploying these weapons against both Iran as well as the various Kurdish elements in the north of Iraq? And then finally, I'll bring it back to Syria's WMD program in a regional context. Okay? And this will deal with the what-ifs. Okay? And the what-ifs that tend to be circulating are, will elements of Syria's arsenal end up in the hands of Hezbollah? Does Iran have any say over how these weapons could be dispersed? And how would, what are the relationship between Israel and Turkey? Perhaps the 2 countries bordering Syria and most concerned about this arsenal. just to give you two examples of what I find are trends in, let's say, mainstream media, Beltway discourse about the conflict in Syria. And I use these examples to show you that there's also a lot of, I would argue, a lot of myths on Syria, a lot of misunderstanding of Syria. And I just take this one article from AFP, which is a reputable news agency, to show you how mistakes can be made, or that how myths can, circulate and develop a narrative that takes on a life of its own. Okay. These are several sentences I just took from this article. Number one, the nature of the Alawite sect in Syria is widely misunderstood. And this is important because it will have ramifications for the Alawite community's relationship with Iran, Hezbollah, the greater Shia community. The Alawites are a sectarian offshoot of Twelver Shiism, Islam, as is practiced in Iran, Lebanon, Bahrain, so on and so forth. Okay. Nevertheless, really what this religion is, and this is important for the Iranian Shia and the Lebanese Shia, or the Iraqi Shia view of the Alawites. Beyond that, even though it's historically an offshoot of Twelver Shiism, but that's about it. If you really study and I know this is a lecture not on, this isn't a school of divinity, and you probably don't care about the kind of beliefs, but it does have a geostrategic importance. If the Alawites are basically Gnostic Christians with a Shia veneer. If you read their liturgy, they incorporate a lot of even apocryphal gospels, a lot of not mainstream Christianity, and create kind of syncretic religion with Twelver Shiism. But nevertheless, that's kind of the overview of what the Alawis are. Okay. And even when I was in Syria trying to ask Alawis, what are the elements of your faith? How do you differ from Twelver Shiism? Even a good number of Alawis in Syria didn't even know the differences. Nevertheless, Alawites believe that the Prophet is merely the veil masking the essence incarnated by Ali, and consider Salman Pak the third figure in the Holy Trinity. Just to show you a mistake, Salman Pak is it's a military facility in Iraq. Okay, so I doubt the Alawites are worshiping Salman Pak as a trinity. It should read Salman al-Farisi, Salman from Iran. Okay, this goes to show you how even fact checking can get sacrificed in kind of mainstream media reporting on Syria. Now, this is the notion that I want to argue against, and it's important because this is when the WMDs come into play. And basically, so here are two talking heads that this AFP reporter asks, okay? And this is their statement. There is the risk that if Assad falls, the Alawite community will simply be wiped out. Okay. Now, why is this kind of notion important, or why do I underline it? Because this was the same thing that was being said about Iraq in 2003. If the Saddam Hussein government falls, the Sunni community will be wiped out. Okay. It's always this kind of apocalyptic scenario. When in fact, no, the Sunni community of Iraq wasn't wiped out after the Saddam Hussein government fall. It's a notion I find with Iraq and with Syria that these communities, you forget the fact that these communities have been living with each other side by side for decades. That they aren't simply barbarians who, the minute the government will fall, will kill their neighbors overnight. Sure, there are horrific sectarian massacres going on, but what those horrific sectarian massacres don't reveal is that not every single Syrian, or Iraqi for that matter, was a barbarian waiting to kill their neighbor who happens to belong to a different confessional community. Nevertheless, I see this over and over again. And with this scenario that gets circulated, the Alawites will be wiped out. They know that if the Bashar al-Assad government is going to fall. Thus, it's the WMD program that will guarantee their survival at the very last minute. What will protect the Alawites and Bashar al-Assad, its confessional leader, it's the WMD program. This is the notion, I would argue, a myth that's repeated over and over again in the mainstream media. What is rarely mentioned, and it was a point that a scholar of Syria, Joshua Landis, made, was that perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps mass sectarian killings won't happen if the Bashar al-Assad government falls. In other words, the Sunni community won't take its revenge against the Alawites. They would probably prefer stability rather than engaging in kind of this revenge attacks. Okay. But nevertheless, what Landis was arguing was that if the Bashar al-Assad government in Damascus were to use weapons of mass destruction, primarily against Arab Sunnis, perhaps then that would be the catalyst for mass elimination of the Alawite community in kind of a retaliatory attack. So he argues it's actually it's counterintuitive. It's the other way around. If Bashar were to order WMDs to be deployed to protect the Alawites at the last minute, that would be the final nail in the coffin of the community rather than saving it. Nevertheless, we also see notions that this conflict is analogous to the former Yugoslavia. Again, I would say another myth. It's the balkanization myths. The former Yugoslavia was also used to apply to the case of Iraq as well. And why I say it's a myth is, for one thing, you're misreading the communities in both states. And the former Yugoslavia was a federation that had the lines to be broken up. Okay. Both Iraq and Syria are both very centralized states. The Yugoslavia example, I would say, it's a misleading one. Just another example then about mainstream media discourse about the question of what will happen if the Bashar al-Assad government were to collapse, if the rebels were starting to make advances. And this is summarized in this one paragraph by David Blair, the Daily Telegraph. I just take this one example to show the common trend in mainstream media reporting. Okay. Assad faces an impossible dilemma, he writes. From his point of view, the only rationale for using these weapons would be if his downfall would otherwise be absolutely inevitable. On the other hand, if he did choose to gas his enemies, that would be certain to trigger a US-led intervention that would seal his fate anyway. So rationality dictates he should not use these weapons under any circumstances. But even if Assad is still a rational actor, is he fully in control? And this is what I'll look at this lecture. How did Iraq maintain control? Can that example be applied to Syria? And does there come a point in the inexorable collapse of a dictatorship when rationality itself goes out the window and the bunker syndrome takes over? So this is the other question I'll look at. If the bunker syndrome takes over, if it does, what are the means or the benefits of deploying chemical weapons at the last minute? Okay. This is just to give you kind of a couple of maps. Again, this is what I would say are repeating the balkanization myths, and the fact that you can't divide up Syria into a neat ethno-sectarian map like this. Okay, for example, this map says here is the Alawite coast of Syria. Sure, Alawites traditionally came from this area, but if you go to the cities such as Latakia, for example, you're going to find plenty of Sunnis there. You'll find plenty of Alawites in Damascus. You can't, ethnically divide up a country. This map doesn't indicate urban-rural migration. Syria can't be divided, nor could Iraq, as they were doing prior to the 2003 Iraq war, into these neat ethno-sectarian maps. But nevertheless, the notion of Syria, or the vision of Syria as this, has also led to kind of this mainstream discourse that if Bashar al-Assad will fall in Damascus, he will create a state similar to Lebanon. He will create a Lebanon for the Alawites. Okay? And the notion of the Alawite enclave keeps on being repeated over and over again. Sure, this is the historical area where the Alawites come from. But nevertheless, Bashar is in control over the full country. It's most unlikely that he'll give up control of the whole country for creating kind of a rump Alawite state. For number one, I would argue it's economically unfeasible, geographically unfeasible. And the notion that he'll take kind of WMDs and move it here to this new rump Alawite state is also kind of an unfeasible notion. Okay? But it's another one that's been circulated in the media. A more realistic map of Syria would be a map like this. Where is the fighting taking place? And the fighting is taking place pretty much where you have population centers. Okay? So you can see almost really what Syria is this kind of crescent. Okay? And where are the WMD facilities? They're more or less, and I'll refer to Sandy's map for a better outline of this, but they are close to the fighting. They are in places like Homs, some places in the north as well. Okay? So the location of these facilities and where the fighting takes place, they are close to each other. But what this map doesn't, what is hard to show on a map like this is that the Syrian rebels, for the most part, control the countryside. They don't control any major urban centers. Some urban centers fall, they go back and forth, but this is really a battle very much like the Iraqis were fighting in the north against the Kurds. The Kurds tended to control the countryside, but they had trouble taking urban centers. And we're seeing that with the nature of the struggle between the Syrian rebels and the Syrian government is very much like the dynamic between the Iraqi government and the Kurds. The rebels usually operate in small groups, usually in mountainous area that's hard to, let's say, move large formations of tanks. And usually the urban centers, fixed centers, usually are held by the government, but now we're seeing a couple of cases where military facilities are starting to fall to the rebels. This is a map from last summer, but more or less kind of gives you an overview of the balance of forces. So you can still see the battle is quite one-sided. What this also reveals is, even though the Syrian rebel army can capture equipment from the government, number one, maintaining these equipment and actually deploying them in an integrated fashion with the rebels has been proven to be quite a challenge. There's one thing about capturing a helicopter, maintaining it and using it in battle is another matter altogether. But nevertheless, even though the forces are lopsided, we're seeing a dynamic that the Syrian military, just like the Iraqi military in another counterinsurgency campaign they fought in 1991, usually can't, we could describe their tactic as firefighting. A particular problem breaks out in one area, they deploy their most loyal military forces to subdue that one area, and then they have trouble holding that area. Okay. They might subdue the rebels, level the city, push the rebels into the countryside, and then take those rebels, the most loyal units to the next fire and subdue that conflict. And so that's what we're seeing. It has the ability to use brute force to subdue rebels when they try to take an urban center, holding for a long period of time, using those most loyal forces. And you have to realize those most loyal forces represent a fraction of what you see on here. That has proven difficult for the Syrian state. Okay, so now let's go to the second part, the Iraqi chain of command. Who was in control, basically? And why is this important? Could it break down in Syria? This is just a long list of now trying to make the point that Iraq and Syria can be compared, that they have that they're quite similar in their structure, even though both Syria and Iraq have a very different history, quite a different colonial history, quite a different ethno-sectarian makeup. Both states were single-party states ruled by the Ba'ath. At one time, both states did consider unifying in the late 70s, but that project to unify fell apart. What they share in common is both states depend on a system of parallel, now when I'm saying both states, I'm talking about Iraq under Saddam Hussein, parallel militaries and parallel intelligence agency structures. What is parallel militarism is that you give up military integration and efficiency in order to create a system of competing military units. Okay? Rather than having one integrated armed forces, you have multiple militaries, with the idea that those multiple militaries, if one unit mutinies, if one branch of the armed forces mutinies, you create a separate chain of command so that other military force will come and save you at your most dire hour. And in both under Saddam Hussein and the Al-Assad government, it's proved effective. The system has foiled several coup attempts in both states. Both developed weapons of mass destruction programs, and both developed similar counterinsurgency tactics. Okay? And what we see in Syria is very much kind of a repeating of the Iraqi playbook used to suppress the Kurdish and Shia uprisings after the '91 Gulf War. Again, this is a kind of a confusing structure to show you how the security apparatus of Iraq as of 2003, and you could do the same thing for Syria. Create it just as a confusing security apparatus, which doesn't bode well for command and control of, let's say, the Iraqi WMD infrastructure. In this sense, there were several layers, and I'll go over those now. Okay. But just to see kind of the similarities of both governments, okay, that even the names of their organizations, now you have to remember Iraq and Syria, after the unification attempt failed, emerged as bitter rivals. Nevertheless, despite the rivalries, they created almost kind of mirror military structures, security structures, so that even the names they kept the same. Both had a National Security Council. This would be the most kind of the highest echelon of both governments in command of weapons of mass destruction. They both had elite military forces. This is what I was talking about. Alongside the regular military, you had a Republican Guard designed to protect the presidency. And then, even though you had the Republican Guard to to defend the presidency. You also had then another elite force called the Special Forces to protect the presidency as well, and the idea was they were supposed to be rivals, not coordinate with each other. Both had similar general intelligence organizations, military organizations. And then they also had then a kind of a third non-official kind of what we could call privatization of violence in the form of these kind of state-sanctioned militias. That both states recognized that there were acts of violence, that even though the loyal Republican guards, even though they were loyal and recruited primarily from the base, the sectarian base of the president, still would not want to carry out. Okay? In Iraq, they were called the Fedayeen. In Syria, they're known as the Shabiha. So, basically what I'll do is take 6 documents to demonstrate command and control, 6 documents to show deployment. And basically what I'm underlining is what I glean from these documents is that chain of command that formed in Iraq. And of course, the most important to remember was that Saddam Hussein was not just president, he was also commander general of the armed forces. Okay? He was the highest military rank in Iraq. Okay? And now keep in mind, Saddam Hussein never served a day in his life in the military. Okay? Never served a day of his life in the army. But nevertheless, upon assuming power, he becomes commander general. And this isn't just an honorary title. He micromanaged the Iran-Iraq war. It wasn't that he gave kind of a hands-off approach and said to the generals, you manage the front. He was micromanaging every aspect of the conflict. And why is this important to kind of understand the apex of the chain of command? The question remains is Bashar al-Assad doing the same? Now, the difference between Saddam Hussein and Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, was Hafez was actually a military man. He was an officer in the Air Force. If he micromanaged the conflicts, such as the 1973 Syrian-Israeli war, he had the military background to do so. Saddam Hussein did not. Neither does Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad technically is not a career officer. He did serve briefly in the Republican Guard. He's a doctor by training. And the question remains, is the president in Damascus micromanaging the conflict? Why is that important? Is when you have a president micromanaging a conflict, usually political considerations trump military considerations. Generals tend, no matter how loyal they are to the state, generals tend to resent civilians, even if it's the president micromanaging the conflict. It's important to know because if WMDs were to be deployed in Syria, is it Bashar who has the final authorization to do so, or is it would it be some general who tried to convince him of the advantages of to do so? But what we do see is there's that in Iraq, it was the president who probably had to, even though we don't have a document with him signing off of it, who probably knew that WMDs were being deployed. It was the nature of his rule that generals never had the autonomy or discretion to deploy WMDs. Most likely because Saddam Hussein had to sign off on every single military engagement. Even if the Air Force were to provide, let's say, air cover to the ground forces, Saddam Hussein had to know about it. Of course, his fear was that the Air Force could be a vehicle to launch a coup. That's why every single kind of deployment of the Air Force in Iraq had to be approved by Saddam Hussein. We do know that there is some military unit called the Chemical Corps. That much we can glean from the documents, the nature of the Chemical Corps, its structure. Still to this day I haven't found documentation, but we do know that there is some kind of military unit devoted to deploying chemical weapons. The question remains, is there an analogy or similar structure in Syria? So that's the first document. And what's interesting is here we see the benefits. What Saddam Hussein is the benefits. What are the benefits of chemical agents? They have extensive striking power. Okay. Now, what he's basically saying in 1983, what we're seeing is that make a lot, manufacture a good number, so it's a deterrent. Okay. Given that they have a high destructive force. So this is kind of chemical weapons, or the knowledge, or the kind of impression of chemical weapons held by Saddam Hussein as of 1983. In other words, he's saying keep them, manufacture them. But at the same time, he's also saying stop using them, at least for now. Okay. The question then remains, why does he say to these armed units, the first corps command, the second corps, the third corps, the fourth corps, so the Iraqi army by 1983 had 4 corps. Why is he telling their commanders now to avoid using them? Okay. And there could be several factors. Those factors, though, aren't mentioned, and the president doesn't have to mention those. Basically, whatever I say you do, I don't need to provide a justification. Was it by 1983 the UN started to investigate Iraqi cases of deployment of chemical weapons? That could have been a factor. Was it that he feared that Iraqi troops were getting hit by the blowback of chemical weapons? We find out later that Saddam didn't really care about that. It wasn't a big deal if Iraqi troops were getting hit by blowback. They should be better prepared. Okay. So perhaps it could be because of international attention, but there is this temporary order to stop using them. Okay. It's a temporary order. Later, the use of these weapons on the battlefield with Iran would be resumed. So we see who's involved in this decision. It's the president, a unit called the Chemical Corps, the heads of the Corps of the Iraqi military, the Armed Forces General Command, the Ministry of Defense, and the Military Intelligence Directorate, the Iraqi version of the DIA. Okay? So there are a couple of agencies now we're seeing that are involved in this process, even though it's pretty much a top-down decision, the president dictating how these weapons are to be deployed when. We also see that the top political body, a National Security Council, very much similar to a National Security Council, let's say in the American context, in 1987, deciding which agencies will control the exchange of biological and chemical agents. And again, it's not so, we have a couple of agencies with their hands in this project. Okay? Department of Defense in Iraq, heavy industries, commerce, higher education and scientific research, agriculture and health. But of course, as well as the intelligence service and the Iraqi version of the FBI. So what you're seeing here is that several ministries are involved in this project, but you also want to have two intelligence agencies competing with each other to monitor this effort. Okay, it's not enough to have the equivalent of the Iraqi CIA monitoring these ministries. You have to have the Iraqi equivalent of the FBI also monitoring how these agents are being handled. Document number 3 shows now the emergence of another organization, and the Syrian case, this organization will be key. If there's an analogy to it, or an organization similar to it, I haven't found any evidence of it. But the key to Iraq's WMD program was an outfit known as the Military Industrialization Commission. It later turns out that when we see all these agencies involved in the deployment of weapons of mass destruction, it turns out it's this body that actually controlled the agents. In other words, Saddam gives the orders, various other ministries are involved in the project, but it seems that it actually holding and giving the authority to deploy to the regular military units. This was the intermediary body. And so the question is, does Syria have a similar body that has tight control over its WMD agents? And it's interesting that they never, in a lot of cases, it was obvious that they're deploying chemical weapons. They even have a chemical core. But rarely do you use the word weapons of mass destruction. And you are encouraged, even in bureaucratic doublespeak, never to refer to it. It was always called special ammunition. Okay. In other words, the staff major general, in this case, who was responsible of armament and supply, has to go to permission to this commission to get those weapons. In other words, any kind of commodity you need, you have to go to this agency. So in other words, they weren't directly in the, of course they're in the hands of the military once they're deployed, but in terms of the actual stockpile, it's this agency within the government that actually controls it. And within this commission, you also have a larger ministry. And this also remains a question. This was a kind of a ministry very much unique to the Iraqi context. I haven't seen evidence of Syria with a similar ministry. But this is a larger ministry devoted to WMD acquisition and deployment. It's the Ministry of Industry and Military Industrialization. Okay. Now, this date is interesting. It's December 31st, 1990, so it's on the eve of the 91 Gulf War. And what are we seeing in this document? Is that even though they weren't used, apparently, chemical agents were prepared to be used, according to what this document tells us. Basically, this ministry who controls the stockpile is telling the Ministry of Defense that 25% of the special ammunition stock, okay, and where is it coming from? It's coming from this establishment responsible for producing that chemical weapons agency, the Al-Assad establishment. And why is this important is, does Syria have its equivalent of a military industries, its Muthanna establishment? This would be key to finding if The control of Syria's WMDs becomes an issue if the government were to fall. Establishments like these will be key to hunting down the WMD paper trail. Basically what they're saying is this establishment, which we control, has produced 25% of the special ammunition within the month. They wanted to make sure it could get to the battlefield units if the command to use them were to be given. Nevertheless, what were they fearing? That if the facility was to be attacked and Baghdad would be contaminated. So this is also an issue that perhaps also the Syrian government is worrying about. Will areas neighboring these establishments be contaminated? And then this is the background about how much do they actually deploy. There were 1,232, according to this report, mustard aircraft bombs. And this seems a lot, right? Did they, at one point from your experience, have 13,000 projectiles? Mustard gun. I mean, does that sound too much, or it sounds like, I mean, but this is how much they were supposed to have ready on the eve of the '91 Gulf War. They were never deployed, but they were preparing for it. In other words, when a battle with a foreign enemy was approaching, and this is a question that we have to ask with the Syria case, if the U.S., if a scenario emerges with the U.S. intervening, and this spells the final days of the Syrian government. Even though Iraq knew that there was a possibility for the U.S. to retaliate with nuclear weapons, and it was indirectly communicated to the Iraqi government, nevertheless, they still made the preparations. Even though they weren't going to use them, they still made this last-ditch effort to produce the agents, get them deployed, and ready. Other people, or let's say other groups that are involved in the missile aspects. January 1991, so this is now 4 days before the war. Iraq's modified Scud missiles, the Al-Hussein missiles, who are inspecting them? Now, when they say testing special warheads, now this is where it's unsure. When they usually use the word special, that connotates kind of a warhead with a chemical agent. Now, we know that they weren't able to do this successfully, mount chemical weapons on the missiles and actually deploy them, as far as the tests indicate. But who's also involved in this process is, and why do we know that these weapons probably had some kind of attempt to use chemical weapons on it, was not only do you have the commander of the missile brigades, 1, 2, but number 5 is a captain who's called a chemist captain. In other words, a captain with chemical experience, a military officer with chemical experience from the Al-Muthanna general establishment. This gives it away that there was a chem relationship there, because he's not only coming from the establishment that produces the chemical agents, he's inspecting the missiles. Number 6 is also giving us an element of the chain of command when missiles are actually deployed. This is a log from somebody who was actually firing the Scuds in February 1991. And what does this document give us is who is he communicating with? In other words, here he is now, here is a person who's actually pushing the button to launch these missiles. Who is he coordinating with? He's coordinating with military intelligence as well as the command of the Air Force. This document, I doubt it was supposed to read Pisa base. I doubt he was targeting this base in Italy. I think it's supposed to read ASA. And what he's logging in is that they are trying to strike the Israeli nuclear facility at Dimona. Okay. At 9:15, Dimona was hit by 3 missiles. What this missile commander is saying. Okay. And basically, he has to report every one of these missile strikes to the commander-in-chief, to the president. Okay. And of course, not only saying that Dimona is hit, it's not just hit, it was revenge for the attack on the Amaria bomb shelter. This was a shelter in downtown Baghdad, mistaken for a command structure, destroyed, and he's saying we hit Dimona, this nuclear facility, in order to avenge this attack on this bomb shelter. So those are 6 documents trying to show you kind of control of command. Who's involved in these decisions? Who's involved in deployment, production? Okay. The next 6 documents is who deploys these weapons and do they have any tactical use? So we go to 1987. Okay. And this is documents with dealing with battles against the Kurdish militias of the Kurdish Democratic Party of Barzani, as well as elements of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, okay, who are working in tandem. And what you have in 1987 is not only the Iraqi military deployed to deal with this threat. So what is this threat? It is a local insurgency. It's a Kurdish insurgency. These are Iraqis working with a foreign threat against the government. And this is why now Halabja, or the kind of the most, the attack against kind of Kurdish civilians is being thrown around now when discussing, would Syria repeat a Halabja? Okay. This is the lead up to the Halabja attacks, these next 6 documents. And what we're showing is this. This is just as another note, not only now were the military deployed, you have to realize that the Ba'ath Party was in command of the military. Okay. The person known as Chemical Ali Hassan al-Majid, he was commanding the military in his capacity as the commander of the Ba'ath Party's northern branch. And so this will add another question to Syria. Does the Ba'ath Party is simply that, it's a political party, do they have any control over Syria's weapons of mass destruction? Because in this case, in the case of the north of Iraq, definitely the party did. The party was the intermediary between Saddam Hussein and the military when deploying these weapons. So does an ideological party have any control over these munitions? They want to use special equipment, again, chemical agents, against the Khomeini guards. That's what they called the Revolutionary Guards, the Pasdaran of Iran. Based within the saboteurs. The saboteur was a euphemistic term for the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Kurdish insurgents. Okay, in other words, they're working together. Barzani of the KDP and his Peshmerga, the Revolutionary Guards, and they're working in mountainous terrain, basically. So the question is, do we have available WMD chemical agents to use against them? Yes, but now, according to their assessment, climate is a factor. Okay. Sarin would not be effective due to the snow, according to their elements. Neither would Tabur. We do have a large quantity of mustard gas, as they say, but for it to have an effect would be a miracle, basically what this author is saying. Its evaporation becomes low in the snow, and we can deliver them by Air Force, helicopters, and at night. Basically, so it's how they can be delivered, but the weather is working against us. Here's another document from the same period. So this is from the same military command. And this is given to the commander of the First Corps. So basically we're seeing that it's the regular military that's deploying these weapons, not the elite Republican Guards. Later it's assumed by the 91 Gulf War, the Republican Guards would later be given command of these chemical weapon stock. But during the Iran-Iraq War, it was the regular military that did have the authority to deploy them. Okay? And the subject is, again, utilizing special equipment, the WMD stock. Okay? The First Corps will prepare a plan. In other words, our military commander, the president, Saddam Hussein, may God save him, ordered our directorate to study with professionals, in other words, the scientific experts, about a surprise attack against the Iranian Revolutionary Guards working with the KDP using special equipment. And how to deliver it, would it be the Air Force, the Army Air Force, or with artillery? Okay. We study the president's order. In other words, so the president is ordering this, and we have to study the feasibility of his order. But we want to postpone it until June because of the possibility of spillover, that we might deploy this and some of the agents might reach into Turkey. And this is also a factor that if this scenario ever emerges in the Syrian kind of mindset, what are the possibilities of these agents spilling over across a border? Apparently it was an issue for Iraq, particularly since Turkey was pretty much non-aligned in this conflict. Why are they needed? Okay. Because Iran is using a local enemy. And this is the case if Turkey, let's say, were to take a more active role in the Syria conflict. They're working together with the Kurds. And basically, let's look at this one. The other option is suggesting to use ricin as well, because of this in this attack against this kind of Kurdish-Iranian alliance.
Excuse me.
Yes?
That was mistranslated.
That's what I thought. That actually, I think that's why I had the slide. I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, because that actually that means sarin.
Sarin, that's what I thought, because I paused it because it didn't seem right that ricin would have been used in this context. That's why I think I had that slide there. Yeah, thank you. Okay, 3 more documents. Who is determining the effect of these attacks? It's the Directorate of Military Intelligence. And what are they keen about? They want to interrogate Iranian prisoners of war to see what effect using these agents have on the battlefield. And what the military intelligence is saying is this. 400 individuals are being killed in this neighborhood. 500 to 600 are being killed in this neighborhood. 2,500 individuals were killed in Halabja. Okay. This is the attack that, of course, raised kind of international headlines, even though Iraq was able to do it with little international sanction. And eventually, this number will increase. So simply, they're trying to get the body count. And for the first time, we see in Iraqi documentation large numbers coming in. They were never sure about the Iranian casualties, but now military intelligence is reporting large numbers of fatalities because of this attack. Okay, so this is basically now the paperwork of the Halabja attack. How many of the enemy did we kill? We killed 600 Revolutionary Guards, 600 to 650 KDP members, 800 to 1,000 other Kurdish militia members working alongside the Iranians. And these are the various parties outside of the KDP. It's not, so basically it's coming, reports are coming, is this inhospitable area that we couldn't deploy large military formations in, it is achieving results. These are how many of the people we ended up killing because of this attack. So that the people who took part in the Halabja attack were given an award, 500 dinars for their involvement in this attack. And the list of the awardees gives us an idea of who is involved in this attack. And again, it also shows kind of the chain of command. So you have your regular staff brigadiers, what I found, and here is this chemical corps director again. So we're finding now that there is a military unit within the regular military specifically designed for deploying these chemical weapons. And also who is involved, who are they coordinating with? Artillery, military intelligence, so on and so forth. This is kind of an assessment now of what had the most effect. Okay, and again, it's General Military Intelligence who's responsible for this, reporting to the Military Industrialization Committee, that body that gives permission to use these weapons, that coordinates the production of these weapons. And what they are saying is that cyanide gas and nerve agents seem to have the greatest impact on the Iranians. Okay. Now, when they were interrogating the Iranian POWs, what they were trying to get was also kind of the value of these weapons. They realized that they were also having a psychological effects because the Iranians were spreading rumors about the Iraqi chemical weapon capability that weren't true, but nevertheless the rumors were having a great value. Okay? In the sense that they were saying these weapons were good because it was causing panic among the Iranian forces, and that when we asked the Iranian POWs what rumors were circulating among the ranks, the rumors were this. That Iraq will use chemical weapons, and this generates fear and panic, which is, a good, it's a valuable aim for the Iraqi military. And they were also interested in the fact that the Iranians believed that Iraq had long-range ballistic missiles that could deliver chemical weapons to Iranian cities. So apparently the Iranians believed this. Of course, there was no evidence that the Iraqis had this capability, but the rumor and the psychological impact was a value in and of itself. And the final document is basically a paper in 1989, where it gives us kind of an indication of and again, we're not sure about how Iraq could have used, would it have been able to use a French plane to deploy chemical weapons, the planes that were given by France. But basically they were saying we could use these Soviet airplanes, these Soviet jets in deploying chemical weapons. All of these 3 are in the Syrian military. And so that was kind of a look at the deployment. Okay. Now the question is, in the final part of this lecture, what could happen, or how, let's look at Hezbollah and Iran, first of all. If we look at Iran, I would argue that the relationship between Iran and Syria historically has been misunderstood. In the sense, you get the idea from kind of reading the current assessments of the Iranian-Syrian alliance that this is kind of a strategic alliance that Iran is almost kind of Syria's most steadfast ally. I mean, this is the impression what you get. What you don't get from that, from this, is that there's been plenty of tensions in that Iranian-Syrian alliance. That it hasn't been kind of such a happy marriage. And of course, this is important because, number one, it raises the question, would Iran abandon Syria in its last hour if it's in interest to do so? The notion that I see most often repeated in the media is Iran is aiding Syria because Syria is ruled by fellow Shias. I see this over and over again. Okay? That the Iranian-Syrian alliance is based on a Shia alliance. That's particularly the perspective in the Arab world, is that this is a Shia alliance. Okay? And why I would say is this misleading is this misreading of Iranian foreign policy. Rather than kind of Iran conducting a foreign policy based on protecting its fellow Shia in the region, I would argue what drives Iranian foreign policy is realpolitik rather than kind of any shared, a foreign policy based on shared sectarian links between the Syrian government and Iran. It's more about having a strategic depth to attack Israel rather than a shared Shia connection that drives the Syrian-Iranian alliance. I would say that even if the Syrian government was Sunni and had that strategic partnership with Iran, that military sharing, allowing it to arm Hezbollah, Iran would have an alliance with the Syrian government. It's not about the fact that they're Shia, and like I said, the Syrians are Shia, but kind of a very far removed sect of Shiism. It's more about realpolitik that drives the alliance. Just to give you kind of some of the contradictions in Iranian foreign policy. Historically, they aided the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But when the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, its branch in Syria, was basically slaughtered in 1982, Iran turned a blind eye to it. Even though Iran shares an affinity with the Muslim Brotherhood, when it comes to forming an alliance with a secular Ba'athist government and turning a blind eye to the Muslim Brotherhood, apparently the Iranian government didn't have a problem with it. So in other words, it's not ideology in this case that was driving Iranian policy. Syria was just simply a valuable ally, even though it was kind of an ideological opposite of the Iranian state. It was a secular Ba'athist government. Okay. Just other examples where Iran doesn't necessarily pursue an aggressive Shia foreign policy. Well, I'll go to just the case of Azerbaijan as a prominent example. And this is just a case in point. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Azerbaijan, which is a country that has perhaps most of its population is 12 or Shia. It's the exact same sect that you will find in Iran. Okay? But rather than coming to the aid of fellow Shia Azerbaijan during that conflict in the Caucasus, it aided Christian Orthodox Armenia. It would prefer that Armenia come out as a victor in that conflict rather than its fellow Shia Azerbaijan. So just kind of an example, it was in Iran's interest that Armenia not be weakened by a resurgent Azerbaijan. Okay. Again, Shiism wasn't driving Iranian foreign policy, it was foreign policy interests. Okay. Based on this relationship, this raises a question which we could address in the Q&A. Does it have any influence on Syria's arsenal? Hezbollah is also a marriage of convenience, not based on shared ideological conviction between Syria and and Hezbollah. Okay. It's part of, I would argue, what emerges after the 2003 Iraq War of the Shia arc myth, the notion of a Shia bloc emerging from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Iran. Okay. Just like Iran doesn't recognize the Alawites of Syria as proper Shia. In fact, the Alawites in Syria did make an approach to the Lebanese Shia to recognize them as proper Shia. Hezbollah said no, but the leader of Amal said okay. Amal is a Shia rival to Hezbollah. Okay. So really what you have in Lebanon, this group doesn't get as much attention as Hezbollah, but you really have two Shia organizations in Lebanon. And Syria always preferred to work with Amal over Hezbollah. So what I'm saying is this, it wasn't always a marriage, a happy marriage. It was the Hezbollah relationship with Damascus was more of convenience. It's often forgotten that Hezbollah and Syria almost came to a war with each other in 1987. Basically, the war was averted because Syria just didn't want to fight Hezbollah. It would have taken too much trouble and too many forces away from its other fights against the other militias in Lebanon. Okay. So I would say again, it's not about ideology or sectarianism, it's a marriage of convenience. Which raises then the question, will Hezbollah inherit any elements of Syria's arsenal? Okay. Again, if it does, it's not because an ideological affinity or because of kind of the shared Shia connection. It will have to be in a case where a weak Syrian government will find it in its strategic interest to proliferate any elements of its arsenal to Hezbollah, if it does so. But having said that, I'm outlining this as well. I'm outlining this past relationship. There's no guarantee Hezbollah will stay to the very end with the Assad government. If it finds it an advantage to abandon Assad and make a deal with what's going to be the winning side, it could happen. I'm not saying it's very likely, but just based on the past precedent, Hezbollah isn't necessarily married to Syria. If it's its own interest to change sides, it could do so based on the past relationship. Let me go over briefly Turkey and Israel, and then I'll conclude. Again, relationships with Turkey and Syria has been up and down. Historically, the tensions between the two states were over water politics. They did come close to war. In 1988, Turkish forces massed on the Syrian border, forcing Syria at that time to expel the leader of the PKK. But then it was followed by a kind of warming of relationships. Okay? And up to the point where Erdogan called Assad a friend, and then again was very much hurt when Assad didn't live to Erdogan's recommendation that he reform the state, and then a resumption of hostilities between the two states. We've also seen with the rise of the AK party in 2001 in Syria, this religiously inspired party, that you've had an alignment between Saudi and Turkish foreign policy, at least when it comes to Syria in this case. Okay? And Ankara, as it was with Iraq, is concerned about Syria's WMD arsenal. It's making preparations if a missile were to be launched on Turkish soil. What about Israeli foreign policy? And this deals with another dynamic. It would like to see Hezbollah's conduit eliminated in Syria. But if the Assad government were to fall, it eliminates Iran's ability to retaliate via Syria and Hezbollah if Israel were to strike Iran's nuclear program. At the same time, this is a positive scenario. The negative is Assad has managed to keep peace along the Golan. He is a devil that the Israelis know. Whereas a new government is a factor that the Israelis would not know about, and could raise the specter of having, let's say, at least a Muslim Brotherhood axis, if that faction in Syria does take power, or at least an Islamist-inspired government in Damascus, forming an axis between Egypt and Syria, something that hasn't occurred since 1958 in the Middle East, where Egypt and Syria unified. The idea of a Cairo-Damascus axis would be probably frightening to Israeli policymakers. It's also wary of the proliferation of Syria's arsenal to Hezbollah. And would Syria's arsenal, and this is a question that's been asked, be deployed against Israel to distract Syria's domestic constituencies? If Syria would have done that, it would have probably had done that during the Gaza showdown a couple of months ago. It didn't seem like, if Syria wanted to create kind of a foreign crisis to at least unite domestic constituencies and kind of take a strike against Israel, it could have done that during that showdown. It, for the most part, stayed away from that conflict. Which brings us to conclusions. Would Syria use WMDs as Iraq did against its Kurdish uprising? Well, the question was the international context was quite different in 1988. Iraq could use them because it knew it could get away with it. It could use them and found them effective. Halabja killed a lot of people, but the value Iraq found in using those weapons against Halabja, it had found much earlier. It wasn't so much the amount of people, no matter how horrific, were killed in those attacks, but the fear it caused. It was the fear that caused that forced Kurdish civilians to stop giving aid to the Kurdish rebels. It was a fear it caused that forced Kurds from the countryside into urban centers that the Iraqi government could better control. And it was a fear it caused against the Iranians allied with the Kurds, that proved its value. And it's the fact that it could get away with it in 1988 without very little international consequences that made chemical weapons a valuable use in the counterinsurgency campaign. Syria knows it doesn't have the luxury Iraq does. It's been declared internationally that would be the red line for international invasion if it were to deploy chemical weapons. So the question is, if international intervention were to occur, let's say regardless if Syria used chemical weapons or not, let's say an international response occurs, let's say due to the civilian atrocities occurring in Syria, then would Syria follow the example of Iraq of then getting ready these weapons to be used against a superior force, as Iraq did in 1991, but still at the end, Iraq refused to use them, knowing it could face a nuclear retaliatory strike. The question then remains now, based on Iraq, we saw that there was a lot of institutions involved in the WMD production and deployment in Iraq. At the end of the day, it was the president who had the authority, and one organization who controlled the stockpile. But nevertheless, if that structure breaks down, who would control those weapons in the case of the breakdown of authority in Damascus? That remains a question. And the question is this: is Bashar a micromanager? Or is it really a general in the field who has authority over these munitions, if they were to be deployed? Is the Syrian Ba'ath Party involved? Another question. Is a party, not necessarily a military unit, do they have the authority? Is there a Syrian version of Iraq's military-industrial committee? Again, something we don't know. Is there one unified body that controls it, that if the government were to fall, would this organization find it in its interest to peacefully hand over the WMD stocks in the hope of creating a new peaceful Syria? That's another issue that remains to be resolved. And then finally, who controls and guards Syria WMD facilities? In Iraq, it was kind of the elite intelligence unit called the Special Security Organization. The most elite military intelligence organization in Syria is called Air Force Intelligence. Do they control the WMD facilities? In other words, if the government were to fall, would foreign governments need to reach out to members in this agency to ensure that these munitions don't proliferate? So, really, I end this presentation with more questions than I answered, but it's the questions generated from looking at the Iraqi example. Okay, and I'll end there.